it was really a whole industry that was very profitable. And what's interesting about the dog mummy is that many times these mummified animals were not the real thing, that there were often fakes that were sold to the public but were not the real thing.
Welcome to The Object Itself, a podcast brought to you by the Albany Institute of History and Art. In each episode, we invite a guest to select one object from our collection or from an exhibition, an object that speaks to them in a unique way. With over 35,000 works in the Albany Institute's permanent collection and over 1 million items in special collections, each piece holds a story, a link to our past, a message for the future. What stories emerge when we devote our full attention to a single object? What contemporary resonances can be found within a 19th century landscape painting, a cast iron stove, a bed frame with feet carved in the shape of dolphins, a painted plaster figurine of Nipper, the RCA Victor dog? In this podcast, we'll delve into the rich histories and personal reflections that our guests bring to the table, revealing how these objects continue to inspire and connect us across time. Whether it's a Hudson River School painting, an antique chair, or an object from everyday life, we'll explore why it matters and what it tells us about our world, past and present. Join us as we take the time to look closer and appreciate the object itself. My guest today is Doug Cohn. Doug has been involved with the Albany Institute since 1998, first as a volunteer docent, which is a role he still fulfills. If you've gone on a docent-led tour at the Institute, there's a high likelihood it was facilitated by Doug. In addition, Doug is a donor, he serves on the Board of Trustees, and he currently chairs the museum's Collections Committee. Doug was also a practicing veterinarian in Albany for 26 years. You'll hear in our discussion how his professional experience informed what would be an important discovery about the Albany Institute's collection. When I invited Doug to come on the podcast, he knew immediately which object he wanted to talk about. He said, quote, "Out of all of the objects that I have seen in my 25 plus years as a docent, the one with which I have had a special relationship is the dog mummy." I'm so grateful Doug has joined me for this conversation. Okay, Doug Cohn, thank you for joining us here today on the podcast.
You're welcome.
I'm really excited to talk about the mummified dog, your object of selection. Now, before we really get into the really kind of fascinating development of your discovery of something very important to this object, why don't we first just begin by describing what are we looking at here?
Well, we're looking at a mummified dog, as you would say, but you wouldn't know it. You're looking on the outside, bunch of linen wrappings, and the top part has been painted almost to look like a modern day Snoopy. But this was, in fact, the way that mummified animals were treated back in ancient Egypt. They were covered with these wrappings, and the wrappings changed depending on the age, or rather the era that we're talking about. Kind of like women's fashions change over the years, so did wrappings. So we can date this to approximately 50 BC to 395 AD, I believe.
And let's give the listener a sense of scale too. How big is this?
I think it's about a foot long. I don't have the measurements in front of me, but I think it's about a foot long and maybe 3 inches wide and 4 inches deep.
And why don't you go into the story of your discovery that this object is in fact a dog prior to misconception?
Sure. So, as you know, I've been associated with the museum for over 20 years. I started out wanting to be a docent. I wanted to be able to give tours of the collection. We had to go through a training period way back when, 2 weeks. So I had to give up a couple of weeks of my vacation time in order to be fully vetted, so to speak, to be a docent. And we went through all of the galleries to learn about the objects, and we got to the Egyptian gallery, and we heard the story of the two human mummies that traveled from Egypt in 1908 and became the most famous objects in our collection. I heard from the trainers back then that the mummies actually went to Albany Medical Center, where I had been working in 1988, to be radiographed, and we found a lot of interesting things about those human mummies. One of which was that one of them had a ceramic toe, which was something very rare in the Egyptology world, and that caused a huge sensation around the world, and people came from all over to see that mummy, and I think it was part of some Australian TV series at some point. Anyway, so that was really exciting to hear about that. And then they turned to another case which had an animal mummy. This was bought from the Metropolitan Museum of Art in 1958, and the Met had it listed as a mummified cat. They probably got it from some collection in Egypt maybe 100 years ago. In any case, we got it, and of course, being the Metropolitan Museum of Art, why should we question their designation? But then when I heard about the human mummies, I said to the trainers, well, did you ever have this mummified cat x-rayed? And they said, no, we didn't, and we really don't have any access to a radiograph machine. So I said, well, I'm a veterinarian and I work in a place where I can get x-rays done. Would you allow me to do that? And they said, of course we would. So they arranged for the mummified cat to go to Albany Medical Center to be subjected to a series of x-rays and CT scans, CAT scans. And after that was done, they showed me the results, the films, and I looked at them and I said, oh my gosh, this is not a cat, this is a dog.
No way.
Yeah. And for me, it was very easy to determine that because the shape of the skull in side view is very different in a cat than a dog. In a cat, you have a dome-shaped outline as a side view, and in the dog, you have a dish-shaped outline. So it was very clear that this was, to me, a dog-type animal, not a cat. And I also sent those radiographs to my alma mater, which was the New York State College of Veterinary Medicine at Cornell, just to have them rectify what I had seen, and they corroborated my results. I also sent the image down to the Museum of Natural History in New York City, and they also said that too. This is a 12-inch animal, so it probably is not an adult dog. It was probably a young dog, and you could tell that by the teeth. They're baby teeth, not adult teeth. So also in the x-ray, you could see that the entire legs were folded up against the bodies, which is a most unnatural position, something that the animal could have not have done in real life. This was to facilitate the wrapping in order to create the mummy. So at this point, I really had no big knowledge of animal mummification. I didn't know that animals were mummified
I
in
didn't know
ancient.
that until I saw these works in our collection.
Yeah, so actually that started me on a journey to learn about animal mummification. I read everything I could. I also started to look for other specimens around the world to purchase. And this took several years of my life, actually, but I amassed a little collection of animal mummies, and these are all now at the Albany Institute in one glass case, the same case where the mummified dog is.
I would love to hear more because this is just so fascinating and just an incredible example of the people who are connected to this museum and the unique and particular expertises they bring. From your perspective as a veterinarian, what I would love to like look at art through your eyes. What do you see? You give this really fascinating talk about representations of birds, shown through our collection, but when you're looking at art, especially when you're seeing animals in art, what are you looking for or what are you noticing?
Well, Animal art is actually one of my big loves. And when I look at a work of art depicting an animal, I want to see how much the artist has taken into account the essence of the animal. Do they really know this animal, or are they just, faking it? Because there's something about the depiction of an animal that has the essence of the animal come through that you can actually connect with. And we do have a lot of wonderful depictions of animals in art. When I was giving my talk on the images of parrots in Western art from the medieval ages through the 19th century and present day, I pointed out some paintings where the artist was using a very bad stuffed specimen. And when you use a stuffed specimen to paint an image of the animal, you don't really get the essence of the animal. There's something very phony that comes through. And I can see that. And that's what leads me to designate some works of art as really wonderful because they capture what that animal is, and others that merely try to mimic it without success.
I never thought about that, but maybe that's why all these years later, kind of the eternal popularity of John James Audubon's illustrations, he manages to capture them in motion a lot of times. What other ones come to mind when you're thinking of, oh, that really got the spirit or the essence of that animal?
Well, Audubon is a good example. He observed lots of birds in their natural habitats. He also took specimens into his own studio to capture more details of the feathers. But I think he was successful because of his observations of real animals in their natural surroundings. One of my favorite artists that I love is Rosa Bonheur, who was a 19th century French artist. She was a woman in a man's world, and she was not thought of, in the same level as a man painting objects. But she was so talented that the critics and the public couldn't ignore her. She too was able to paint animals that gave the essence of them to the viewer. And she was recognized for that. She often dressed in man's clothes because she didn't think by wearing women's clothes that she would be taken seriously. But she's another one that really is able to capture the essence of animals in her works.
So, turning back to our mummified dog here, I'd love to know, what about this particular region of the world, this particular period of time? What about it attracts you?
Well, as I said, I really didn't know a whole lot about ancient Egypt. I'd studied it, obviously, like all of us in, elementary school in New York State schools. But when I found out about the mummification of animals, that really got me onto a track to try and understand that. So to reiterate something that maybe you remember from your school days, that ancient Egyptians worshipped many gods, and many of the gods took animal forms. And there were temples that were dedicated to specific gods. You would go to these temples and make an offering in the hopes that that god would help you in some way. Because there were so many gods that had a shape of an animal, there were animals that were raised in large numbers in ancient Egypt only to be sacrificed as tokens to be given to the gods in their temples. So cats were raised in large numbers in ancient Egypt with the specific goal to kill them, mummify them, and then to sell them to the public so that you could buy your mummified cat and you would go into a temple devoted to Bastet, who was one of the Egyptian gods who often took the shape of a cat or a lioness in a temple. You would offer this mummified cat, and hopefully your wish will come true. There were all sorts of animals that were mummified, from fish to mongooses to shrews to dogs to bulls to sheep, baboons. It was really a whole industry that was very profitable. And what's interesting about the dog mummy is that many times these mummified animals were not the real thing, that there were often fakes that were sold to the public but were not the real thing. And there were some, for example, sometimes these supposed mummified animals only contained a couple of feathers and a few stones. Business practices were just as shady in ancient Egypt as they are today. So if you look at the outside of this mummified dog, you really have a hard time saying that this is really a dog. In some lights, it looks like a cat. And I think that was probably the intent, to sell this dog mummy as a cat, because there was a lot more worship of cats than there were dogs back then. But this is not unusual.
And is it a common practice, as we see here in our mummified dog, for there to be some sort of painted motif referencing the animal that's mummified itself?
Yes, absolutely. And you see many examples of this in other museums like the Met, the Louvre, the National Gallery in London. Many of those painted mummies look very realistic in terms of what, you can tell immediately this is a dog or a cat. This one is kind of in between. You can't say for sure it's a dog, you can't say for sure it's a cat. And I think that's probably was the intent of the person who made this mummified specimen.
And I guess just to close out, I would love to hear, your perspective, especially you've been a longstanding volunteer docent. You are directly connecting with people, facilitating these connections with our audiences and these works of art. What's the importance of these connections with art, stopping and taking a moment to really observe, to really study? You hear these statistics about people, the average view time in front of a work of art is like 3 seconds or something like that. What do you make of all of this?
Well, I think you're right. I think a lot of people, when they go to museums, they maybe spend a few seconds looking at an object and then they move on without really trying to understand what it is they're looking at and maybe the context. When I give tours, I try and put these objects in a context. In the context here, we're talking about an artifact that really speaks to kind of business practices that were around so many thousands of years ago, how animals were treated back then. Sometimes we're horrified about what we do with animals in today's life, but there were some horrendous things that were done to animals
Right.
back then. I'm hoping that people come and they take the time to really look and really think about the objects when they go to museums.
Thank you for listening to this episode of The Object Itself with Doug Cohn. Be sure to check out the information in the show notes about the mummified dog, as well as the Albany Institute of History and Art's extensive collection of Egyptian artifacts. You can browse these objects through the museum's online collections database available on our website. You can also visit the dog mummy, in addition to the Albany mummies and many Egyptian objects from antiquity, on view in our galleries as part of a long-term exhibition. That's all for this episode, and I hope you'll join me for the next episode of The Object Itself.